I can guarantee you that you likely do not know your historic origins of the systems that you have within your life. Now, I could have just said your historic origins. We may talk about the origins of human existence, but that is separate from the systems that we create. We may think that our systems have always existed, but perhaps that is not the case. The following information is all mainstream and not a theory, so let us begin with our understanding of human history, because what we really want to understand are what is the historic origins of government, and you will find out it's the historic origins of slavery. BC, or before Christ, and BCE, or before Common Era, are the same, and they're counting down before the year 1. AD, which is Anno Domini, and CE, which is Common Era, are the same, counting up after the year 1. BP, which stands for before present, counts before the year 1950 AD, or CE. Humans supposedly first appeared on Earth around 300,000 years ago in the Middle Paleolithic Stone Age, which was from 300,000 BP to 50,000 BP. The first and oldest form of government was known as the Sumerian Empire, or Ancient Mesopotamia, first settled between around 4,500 to 4,000 BC. This is also when systemic slavery was officially first established. Slavery has historically also been known as an established institution, most often claimed to be necessary for the economy, morality, and an overall productive world. Is the foundation of slavery and government being together a strange coincidence, or is there an important connection that we aren't seeing? It is worth noting that Sumerian ancient religious texts reveal the figures Enlil and Enki talking about creating a slave species with disputes between the two brothers. It also details how they went about purposefully weakening intellect or strength in order to maintain a slave species that would make perfect workers who would not rebel, not too stupid and not too intelligent. This is controversially detailed in texts such as Slave Species of God, The Story of Humankind from the Cradle of Humankind by Michael Tellinger. However, if we do the math, it has been about 6,000 plus years since the first form of government and the invention of chattel slavery. It has been about 200 years since the abolitionist movement for ending chattel slavery, and it has been about 300 years since the founding fathers of America challenged the authority of monarchies or kings and queens. So for about 294,000 years or so, human beings lived without any form of government or systemic slavery that we can account for. In Sumeria, the authority of rulers or masters was seen as legitimate, as they had the supposed divine right to rule, as a priest class above others who were not. So ask yourself, how does someone obtain the right to rule? And does that fit into how we view rights and voluntarism or morality? Are you aware of what voluntarism is? What do you define morality as, and would you uphold morality above legality? From our own analysis of these concepts that we have detailed within this documentary, nobody can be born into this world as a master or vested authority unless they are able to convince others physically and mentally that they are a special kind of human, just as it was done in Sumeria. This authority isn't a right that they are born with, it is a right that never can and never will exist. It is entirely of belief. There is little to no evidence to be found of systemic slavery occurring until the founding of the Sumerian Empire, as slavery was practiced in every ancient civilization known thereafter. So for thousands of years, people had chattel slavery and people did not question it, and if it did get questioned, it obviously was overturned, as only recently, 200 years ago, has it been actually challenged in the aggregate. So how can the established institution of chattel slavery be created without a system of mass violence in place that allows it? How can it be systemic without a system, especially as an unnatural condition? These may be the questions that daunt us now. The oldest law codes of these ancient empires often convince their populace about the legitimacy of their system, the need for masters and slaves, proclaiming to be of equity and truth as it says in the law code of Ur-Nammu, or to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak as it says in the law code of Hammurabi. So how can these law codes claim to enforce good in the world while they are actively partaking in evil and slavery? What if this type of deception is intentional? You can look up any hierarchical chart of these ancient empires, and the structure is one and the same. Kings and slaves, with the most freedom at the top and the least freedom at the bottom. Is having less freedom or more freedom actually freedom? A slave could feel grateful and content in what they are given, but that doesn't mean that they are living the life they are meant to live, for what makes the master special? These same ancient empires would tell their slaves what their rights are and deciding upon their own whims what their punishments are to be. To reiterate, they even had systems in place where the slave can work for their freedom, which would be granted to them by their master, known as manumission or enfranchisement. Let us remember, it did not matter what the slave masters decided to title themselves, whether they were priests or priest kings, or what they tried to make sound just and make better, as they were still engaging in the slavery of others. Simply leaving other people alone is no option for the slave master. And so from a historic view, people may correlate slavery with the growth in population. However, this disregards our study on the nature of slavery, including why people are willing to put up with it despite knowing how immoral it is, or how they wouldn't have done it themselves and to themselves. When we are able to look at the amassed reasons, the disregard and lack of morality, the idea that might makes right, the focus on centralization and collectivism, justifications and deceptions made to violate individual rights, the result of war or the monopoly on violence, the obedience to presumed and claimed authority, or even the growth of mass agriculture and industry, our detachment from source, with all these reasons contributing to malnourishment, poverty, and disease, we can come to understand why the slave felt powerless or needing to accept their condition, or why the master felt powerful in doing everything to keep their condition. Such imbalances keep crashing down, but quickly become imbalanced again, since, as 16th century writer Etienne de la Boétie says, people tend to enslave themselves. From the Liberty newspaper in the 1800s, "You must not disturb my authority, because it was ordained by God that I should rule," said the king. "Slavery is a divine institution," protested the Southern planter. Larkin Rose, a philosopher, author, and movie script writer, says, "The notion that people, by virtue of their mere existence, are entitled to all sorts of things which come into being only as the result of human knowledge and effort, is delusional. The logical result of this supposedly loving and compassionate worldview is violence and slavery, because if one's need entitles him to something, that means that it must be forcibly taken from anyone else who has it or can produce it, if he will not supply it willingly." Thomas Clarkson, an abolitionist, said Africa was a country divided into many kingdoms, which had different governments and laws. In many parts the princes were despotic, in others they had a limited rule, but in all of them, whatever the nature of the government was, men were considered as goods and property. and as such subject to plunder in the same manner as property in other countries. The persons in power there were naturally fond of our commodities, and to obtain them, which could only be done by the sale of their countrymen, they waged war on one another, or even ravaged their own country, when they could find no pretense for quarreling with their neighbors. In the courts of law many poor wretches who were innocent were condemned, and to obtain these commodities in greater abundance, thousands were kidnapped and torn from their families and sent into slavery. Such transactions, he said, were recorded in every history of Africa. That one set of men should be slaves to another, the truth was as old as it was universal. It was recognized in every history, under every government. It was received in some of the islands with a declaration that they might possibly, in some instances, endeavor to improve the condition of their slaves, but they should do this not with any view to the abolition of the slave trade, for they considered that trade as their birthright, which could not be taken from them, and that we should deceive ourselves by supposing that they would agree to such a measure. Never heard whether Mr. Fox, when he came into power, made any stipulations with His Majesty on the subject of the slave trade, but this I know, that he determined upon the abolition of it, if it were practicable, as the highest glory of his administration, and as the greatest earthly blessing which it was in the power of the government to bestow, and that he took considerable pains to convince some of his colleagues in the cabinet of the propriety of the measure. So the government seeks the credit of ending chattel slavery. For evil, when once sanctioned by governments, spreads in a tenfold degree. In no instance has this been verified more than in the case of the slave trade. While they acknowledged the necessity of removing one evil, they were terrified by the prospect of introducing another, and were therefore only able to relieve their feelings by lamenting in the bitterness of their hearts that this traffic had ever been begun at all. Wallace, in his system of the laws of Scotland, maintains that neither men nor governments have a right to sell those of their own species. Men in their liberty are neither purchasable nor saleable. And after arguing the case, he says this is the law of nature, which is obligatory on all men in all times and all places. Would not any of us who should be snatched by pirates from his native land think himself cruelly abused and at all times entitled to be free? Have not these unfortunate Africans who meet with the same cruel fate the same right? Are they not men as well as we, and have they not the same sensibility? Let us not therefore defend or support any usage which is contrary to all the laws of humanity. And of course, this may relate to how people are treated as property by governments through birth certification and citizenship. Jeremy Locke says, collectivism teaches that good things can come from compulsion. It teaches that people can be forced to accomplish things for their own good. It pirates the love people have for their neighbors and twists it into authority's demands. Slavery is the result. If an individual will not choose a thing, then it is not good for him. Force crushes the human spirit. Choice enables life. As in every instance in history, the pattern of tyranny repeats itself by reinventing lies to hide the same slavery. And of course, we may also look at the Tytler cycle, which represents this idea that history repeats. However, there are new inventions and ideas, including technology and the progression in our moral development to end chattel slavery. The perceived order takes place as the following: faith, courage, liberty, abundance, selfishness, complacency, apathy, dependence, bondage, and back to faith. These are 8 steps, 4 steps on each side, separated by selfishness, which may be seen as the bridge from good to evil. With a deep understanding of slavery, as by the victims realizing their freedom, selfishness does not need to manifest into complacency, since the master's claim over the slave will not persist. In other words, the slave will not allow selfishness in the slave master claiming ownership over them. If they did, but were transported to another plantation, we may say this cycle will repeat. This is due to the fact selfishness represents entitlement and self-absorption, whilst complacency represents a lack of personal responsibility and conscience. In ending the deadly cycle of slavery for good, the slave with their knowledge would say about their masters, "What entitlement?" and take control of their own life. Join us for part 2 of this part of the documentary, where we talk about the true nature of government and how it is actually slavery as seen through many historic writings. This is a shocking revelation that no historian and no psychologist and no mainstream abolitionist or former slaves will tell you, but the deeper you go, you realize there were many writers who wrote about this. So why do we not hear this perspective? Thank you for watching this part of the docu-series Slavery Gone for Good. Be sure to watch our other parts for a more deep understanding as to the nature of truth and action in its fullest extent. If you want to learn more and hear more quotes that have not been discussed in this video, be sure to buy the book Slavery Gone for Good Black Book Edition. This is the most important work in history, and you are part of that work. Do not forget it. As Frederick Douglass, former slave and abolitionist, said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave."